Welcome to Let's Talk Feca Part 2. In this video, we're going to take a look at the three main roles of the class and see if they fit with the current spell kit. I'm going to go over every single spell the Feca has, see what it does, and mention if it's good or if there are any issues with it. And at the end, I'll go over the spells to suggest improvements that can be made for an appropriate class balancing. But before we start, remember there was a giveaway in Part 1, so let's see who's going to win this small house in a Machna. I counted 42 entries, so I'm going to generate a random number between 1 and 42, and then just see who wins. 23. So let's find the 23rd participant that entered the giveaway. 1, 2, 3. 11. I'm skipping people who didn't add their username because that was a requirement. 21, 22, 23. So disappointed. Congratulations. I hope you're not disappointed because you actually won a small house in a Machna. Congratulations, I'll find a way to contact you and get you your small house. Alright, back to the video. So Feca's three main roles are Protector, Tank, and Debuffer. As a Protector, you defend your allies by giving them damage reduction, whereas, for example, as a Masquerader, you would give them shield points. As a Tank, you basically protect yourself and you keep enemies next to you, and as a Debuffer, you reduce the effectiveness of enemies by removing their stats or by giving them specific states to make them weaker. So we're going to go over all the spells, but first I want you to keep in mind these three main roles, so Protector, Tank, and Debuffer, and also keep in mind that Feca is a 2-star difficulty class. My critique is going to be based on gameplay for a level 200 character, so when the full spell kit is available. So I've divided the Feca spell kit in the following categories. First we have Protection, then we have every element, so air, water, earth, fire, and multi-element, and then we have Mobility and Debuffing. For every spell, I'm going to ask myself three main questions. What does the spell do? Is the spell played? And am I satisfied with the spell, or are there any problems with it? Okay, so for protection spells, the first one we have here is Rampart. Rampart basically gives a damage reduction to the caster and the allies within the zone. It's very much played, just like Fortification, its variant, which gives damage reduction but only to the caster, but this time it's a stronger reduction. Both of these spells are played, they're very good. The only thing one could argue is that Rampart has a duration of only 2 turns, which is not enough if you get debuffed, but it's still a very good spell. So the next spell we have is Barricade. Barricade, everyone knows it. It's a melee invulnerability that you can give to anyone in your team. The spell costs 2 AP and can be debuffed. And something most people don't know is that if you hit the target of Barricade at a distance, they can actually gain up to 2 MP. The other invulnerability spell is Bastion, which gives a ranged invulnerability. It also costs 2 AP and can be debuffed, and the effect here is that if you hit the target in melee, then they gain up to 300 power. Now both of these spells are very good and they're played a lot. Barricade is played mostly when you're playing solo in melee or when you're playing in a team, and Pavis, which is its variant, is also played when you're playing solo but at a distance, so you can use it as mobility combined with the spell Excursion Glyph that we'll get to later. The thing with these two invulnerability spells is that they can be debuffed and they only last 1 turn anyway, so that's the biggest weakness of these spells. Pavis is a static summon that really does nothing, but it has the invulnerable to range damage state, so you're basically just summoning a wall to protect yourself for 3 AP. Okay, Aegis. Aegis is a static summon that sacrifices any ally within the zone. The zone is a circle of 3 cells, and the center is not considered within the Aegis. The Aegis lasts 2 turns, and it's a very strong spell, played a lot, and I don't really see any problems with it. It's a very good spell. The next protection spell we have is Truce. Truce basically reduces the damage suffered by everyone on the map, and then on the next turn, the Feca gets the pacifist state. The spell is pretty useful in certain situations, like if you need to buy some time, or just tank some extremely big damage that you know is coming, or in Proto, for example, just to bypass the mechanic and keep hitting while you're pretty much invulnerable. Next we have Ataraxia. Everyone knows this spell because it used to be extremely strong by reducing the next line of damage you would receive, but now it was nerfed a little bit, so instead of completely reducing the next line, it reduces it by 75%, and the spell also gives the gravity state. The spell is extremely good, it's played all the time because its variant is pretty much garbage, and there's no problem with it really. It's pretty useful, only costs 2 AP, but its variant, it's called Reinforced Protection, And the reason I say it's really garbage is because it's very counterintuitive. You basically increase your power and the power of glyphs, but you disable all your protection spells. I don't know who designed the spell, but it doesn't make sense. It's never played unless you know you're winning turn 1, and it's a pretty much obsolete mechanic. Finally, we have Feca Shield, another spell that reduces damage suffered. This time, instead of being flat reduction, it's a multiplier. You can give it to yourself or to allies. It's a linear spell, and it costs 2 AP. Okay, let's go through agility spells. So first we have Typhoon. Typhoon costs 3 AP. It deals damage in a linear zone, and it steals agility from the targets. The damage is not very high, but it's still played because its variant is not really usable in melee, which is Gust. Gust basically deals damage and pushes targets by 1 in a zone of 3 cells horizontally. It's a bit weird to play this spell, especially when you want to combine it with Fulminating Glyph, because Fulminating Glyph is an agility spell that increases your damage in melee, and using Gust, you're just pushing away your target, unless there's a target behind, so you're dealing a bit of pushback damage. But in general, it's not worth it because Typhoon steals characteristics, so you'll get stronger with Typhoon. Next, we have Swelling, which is also an agility spell that pushes pretty good damage, to be honest, for 4 AP, and it pushes 2 cells. Now this spell is probably the hardest hitting for the agility path. It's very good, except again, it's a bit weird that the agility path has some pushing spells, considering it's a melee element and you're pushing only 1 or 2 cells, and also that you're based around the Fulminating Glyph that increases your damage in melee. So it's a bit weird to cast your Fulminating Glyph and then push your target somewhere else. So Fulminating Glyph is basically a spell that you cast on the enemy, and it places a glyph aura around the enemy. So any ally that walks on that aura will get a boost of 20% melee damage. This is an extremely good spell, and it's pretty much always played because the variant of that is a start of turn glyph, which are really all problematic on Feca. It is a bit sad because this glyph is really good. It reduces the damage of anyone on it by 20%, and it also attracts towards the center. Now, one of the problems of this glyph is that just like all the other start of turn glyphs on Feca, it also affects your allies. So you'd be removing damage from your own team, which is kind of counterproductive. Another issue with this glyph, and it'll be the same issue for other start of turn glyphs of the class, is that once you've placed the glyph, you can't move it until you can cast it again. So the enemies can usually get out of it pretty easily, especially in PvP, so you've just lost one of your 4 elemental spells for quite a few turns. And lastly, the last agility spell is Shiver. Shiver pulls towards the caster, and a lot of people don't know you can cast it without the line of sight, even though it's only from 1 to 3 range. Sometimes it's pretty useful, so you can pull targets through your allies if you're next to them, for example. The spell is pretty good. I don't really see any issues with it. So the first water spell we have is Bubble. Bubble costs 2 AP, deals water damage, and removes range. It's played a lot, and it's a very good spell because it can be cast from very far away, and it deals pretty good damage for only 2 AP. Next we have Cloudy Attack. Cloudy Attack is a linear spell that deals damage in the water element and steals chance. It's played a lot because stealing chance also means you're buffing your own statistics, and combined with the Feca class boots, you remove the restriction that makes it only castable in line, so it becomes a really great spell. The problem with it is that you have to use class boots to make the spell really work. So the variant is Stormy Attack, which is an AoE spell that costs 5 AP and removes 30% critical hits. It's never played because it's not range modifiable, and its variant is Cloudy Attack, which is much better. Next we have Tension, which is probably the best chance spell on Feca. It costs 5 AP, but with the Feca class boots you can bring it down to 4, and it deals pretty high water damage, as well as pushing 4 cells. It's a ranged modifiable spell, just like Bubble and Cloudy Attack. The issue here is that it costs 5 AP, so you have to use Feca class boots to make this work. Next we have Paralyzing Glyph. This glyph deals damage in the water element and removes 6 range. It's a pretty good spell, and it's actually usable when playing Chance, compared to other elements where playing with the glyph is not that useful. The variant is the Roaming Glyph, which deals damage in the water element, and with the Feca class boots, you can actually cast the spell without line of sight, so it becomes really, really strong. What this glyph does is that it creates a glyph aura around the target, and allies walking on the aura will get 50 dodge. It's played a lot, mostly for its damage, and because you can use it without line of sight with the class boots, but the dodge buff is not really useful, so it's not played for the right reasons. So Earth is the element of AP reduction. We have some Earth and some neutral spells on the class. The first spell we have here is a neutral damaging spell that deals damage in a cross and removes AP, and when you're playing AP reduction, you want to take that over Dazzling. I don't really see any issues with blindness, it's a pretty good spell overall. Its variant is Dazzling, it deals damage in the strength element and attracts around the caster 3 cells. Dazzling's damage is pretty high, but it can only be cast once per turn, which makes sense. It's played a lot if you're playing melee as multi-element for example, but playing strength without AP reduction is not really viable. Next we have Backlash. Backlash is a very strong spell for only 3 AP. It steals characteristics in the strength element and can be only cast linear or diagonal. The variant of Backlash is Tetany. Tetany is another AP reduction spell, and it's also a neutral spell. It costs 4 AP and removes more AP than Blindness. It can also only be cast in melee. The next strength spell we have is Torpor. Torpor deals damage in the strength element and removes dodge from the target. It's pretty hard to have a lot of lock on the strength element, so removing dodge is not necessarily that interesting. And finally, we get to the glyphs. Blinding glyph, I think, is the biggest glyph that the Feca has. It's a circle of 4 cells, and it removes AP in that whole zone. The center of the zone is not part of the glyph though, and again, it also removes AP from allies, so that's one of the biggest problems with the glyph. Apart from that, the spell is pretty good, and if you're playing AP reduction, ideally you want to have that glyph, but because you remove AP from your own allies and from yourself, most people will go with Protective Glyph. Protective Glyph adds another layer of protection. You basically cast it on any target and it will create a 2-cell aura around it, and any ally within that zone will get their damage suffered reduced. Okay, so for fire spells, let's start with Natural Attack. Natural Attack deals damage in the fire element, steals intelligence, costs 3 AP, and is from 1 to 8 range, non-modifiable. Its variant is Natural Attraction, which deals pretty high damage, pulls the target 2 cells, and can be only cast linear. Natural Attraction usually is used when you're playing another element, because when you're playing Int, you actually want as much characteristics as possible, so you would go with Natural Attack. But apart from that, both spells are useful in their own situation. Intelligence is the path of MP reduction for Feca, so we have Lethargy here, which costs 4 AP, only castable from 1 to 3 range, and reduces MP. The spell is not really played because it only has 1 to 3 range max. Its variant is Lifelessness, which costs 5 AP, but deals pretty good damage and steals even more characteristics than Natural Attack. Again, it's a non-modifiable range spell, from 1 to 6. Lateral Flame is a very good spell, no matter what element you're playing. It deals damage in a horizontal line, and it pulls targets towards the center. It can be cast from 1 to 6 range, and again, non-modifiable range. Next, we get to the glyphs. Burning Glyph is a glyph that deals damage in the fire element and removes MP. It's a big square of 2 cells. It costs 3 AP, and it can be cast from 1 to 4 cells. Again, it's not really played because glyphs affect the allies, so yourself and your teammates, so you'd be removing your own MP. And once the enemy is out of the glyph, you can't really move the glyph, so you've just lost the spell for the next few turns. Its variant is Perception Glyph, which increases your range. It's a bit weird because all your intelligence spells are non-modifiable range, so this is really only a buff for your allies, or if you're playing another element. So yeah, it places a glyph aura, and any ally that walks over it will get a 5 range buff. The range is modifiable, and it's a pretty good damage spell for only 3 AP. For multi-element, Feca only has 2 spells, which are variants of one another. We have Repulsion Glyph and we have Barrier. Repulsion Glyph is a 2 AP glyph that deals damage in every element if the target ends their turn on it. It's a very strong spell. It only costs 2 AP, and it's mostly used in melee when you lock your enemies and you try to force them to end their turn on it. It can also be used at a distance in PvM if you want to predict where the enemies will go and try to force them to a certain direction. The variant is Barrier. Barrier puts the gravity state on a target when they start their turn, and it also creates, well, obviously a barrier around them when they start their turn. And if they cross that barrier, then the damage will apply to them, but the gravity state will go away. These 2 spells really can't complain, extremely strong spells, and they're very fun to play. So now we get to mobility spells. Let's start with Teleglyph. Teleglyph just teleports the Feca from 1 to 6 range, and if you land on a start of turn glyph, then damage is applied right away all over the glyph. It costs 3 AP and it has a cooldown of 3 turns. It's played a lot even though its variant is Aegis, and both spells are really good, so it's kind of a hard choice to make. The next mobility spell we have is Backup, which costs 3 AP, can only be cast linearly, and teleports the Feca to the first cell available between the Feca and the target. It's a really good spell, and it's really fun to play with because you can just teleport to your allies and give them protection. The next mobility spell is Excursion Glyph. Basically, you place a glyph on the ground for 2 AP from 1 to 6 range, and if an ally walks on that glyph, then they switch positions with you. You can also target an ally right away to change places with them during your own turn, and therefore increase your mobility that way. The last mobility spell is Maneuver, which costs 3 AP from 1 to 4 range linear, and it switches positions with the target. Now Maneuver is the variant of Bastion, so you can probably figure that Maneuver is almost never played. Finally, we have some debuffing spells like Inertia. Inertia applies the gravity state all around the Feca and increases the Feca's lock. Is it played? Not really, mostly because it's a variant of Feca Shield, and you need Feca Shield to tank a lot. So Inertia is really only used in specific situations, like in Cat's Eye for example, if you're tanking the boss. Another spell I put under debuffing is Gravitational Glyph. This glyph applies both the Unshakable and the Gravity state. It's a really good spell, except it can handicap the whole team if not used in the right situation. I'd say the problems with this glyph is that a lot of monsters, mostly bosses, kind of ignore it and still jump or teleport away, but that's a problem with the game in general, not necessarily with this spell. Same thing with Eliotropes, for example, being able to get away from the glyph using portals. It's not a problem of the glyph per se, it's more a problem of Eliotropes. So because we don't actually know if the next update will have a complete rework of the class or just some spells adjusted here and there, I'll be suggesting both urgent improvements that are very specific and also new ideas that have more flexibility. If it's just about keeping the same spell kit and making the most urgent improvements, then here's what I would suggest. Number 1 is moving variants around to have 5 spells available at the same time instead of 4 in every element. Ankama has been doing that for mostly every class rework recently, so I'm kind of expecting them to move variants around so as to have more spells available at the same time for each element. For example, swap Typhoon with a natural attack, and that way when you're playing Intelligence, you can have both natural attack and natural attraction at the same time, and you can have Typhoon and Gust at the same time if you're playing Agility. Also notice how it's kind of counterproductive to play by element as Chance and Agility at the same time, because you'll have to choose between Bubble and Swelling, and you'll also have to choose between Shiver and Tension. Next, to improve the Protector role, we really need Barricade and Bastion immune to Embewitchment, just like you can't remove Anika Flip's Repercussion for example. Here we're talking about the Protector class, so being able to debuff an immunity that only lasts 1 turn kind of doesn't make any sense. On top of that, you can already kind of counter these immunities by hitting distance if a barricade is applied, and by hitting in a melee if a bastion is applied. In PvP, a lot of classes can debuff before even hitting, so these spells are basically a waste of AP. These spells also have a pretty long cooldown, so being debuffed means you haven't gotten the chance to use the spell and you have to wait to use it again. Another way to improve the Protector role would be to remove the Glyphorce state on the Reinforced Protection spell. This is an obsolete mechanic that really makes no sense on the class. It's not relevant for the current gameplay. Disabling Feca protection spells with no way to bring them back is really a huge handicap for the class. If we want to keep such a spell, consider maybe making the spell castable at any time. The first cast would disable protection spells but increase the power, and the second cast would cancel these effects and bring back protection spells. But really, the concept of disabling protection spells makes no sense. The next improvement is really simple, just make start of turn glyphs not affect allies. This is a huge problem in the class, because most people don't even use these glyphs anymore because you're affecting your allies too much, you're handicapping your own team, there's no synergy between you and your allies when you're playing with those glyphs. Another way to improve the debuffer role is to make Stormy Attack actually playable, because it does have a debuffing ability which is removing critical hits. Now this spell is 5 AP, which is way too much. I'd make it 4 AP and even make it castable at 0 range, so on yourself, so that way you actually have a chance of playing melee with that spell, even though I know that Bubble and Tension both have a minimum range. Another great idea to improve the debuffer role and to improve glyphs in general on the Feca class is to add a mechanic where if you cast a glyph on yourself, so on the 0 cell, then the glyphs would actually follow the Feca wherever the Feca moves, kind of like corruption. That way you'd have like more incentive to play, for example, Burning Glyph that removes MP, because you can just follow your target and your glyph will follow you. Now to improve the tank role, I think the maneuver spell really has to be buffed. I'd make it maybe 2 AP and castable more than once per turn. This way it would actually be a good variant of Bastion, because losing a ranged invulnerability is really tough, so you have to make maneuver a good spell. I think improving this spell would open up more combos for the Feca to keep and tank enemies nearby. What you have to understand here for Feca is that Feca has a hard time placing monsters around, and even though I know Feca doesn't have a positioner role, being able to just move monsters around in a small area around you is enough to be a good tank. To improve the debuffer role even more, what I would do is change the effects of the inertia spell. The reason for this is because no one's going to get rid of Feca Shield because it's a really good spell, so what you want to do is make its variant really good as well. In this case, what I would do with the inertia is add an effect where you would remove damage from enemies, so like reducing their final damage or reducing their fixed damage, or something like giving them pacifist state. Of course, I know that's really strong, but maybe add an after effect, kind of like truce. There's a lot of ideas here, but the debuffing role of Feca is way too weak, especially here we see that you have a lot of spells to steal characteristics, and stealing characteristics is not really a good way of reducing an enemy's efficiency. Ironically, if you look at Masquerader, which doesn't have the debuffing role, you'll see that they have way better spells for debuffing. For example, we have like Pontera, which removes 50 damage from enemies, or you even have Transfiguration, which literally removes resistances from enemies. Now when you look at these spells, you're like, shouldn't Feca get that instead? The Masquerader doesn't even have the debuffing role. Now what if the next update is actually a complete rework of the class? Then in that case, I would suggest different things. First of all, I suggest to add a Feca passive, kind of like other classes also already have a passive. The thing that I mentioned earlier, where the glyphs follow you if you cast them on yourself, could be one example of a Feca passive. Another thing I would suggest to Ankama is really to make the glyphs the center of the Feca gameplay, because Feca is really lacking identity, and everyone wants to play with glyphs, but we can't really do that because they're really handicapping. A few more things I could suggest would be adding a Gobble summon, because we know that the Feca is a shepherd, and the summon could be useful for any of the three roles really, protector, tank, and debuffer. Thinking about it, the Osamoda's Strength summon is basically a good example of what would be nice on Feca to have a summon that can tank and that can reduce the enemy's damage. Throwing more ideas out there, it could be really nice to have a spell that applies either the weakened state or the pacifist state to really improve the debuffer role, or even a spell to protect from Bewitchment for a small period of time. So yeah, I don't really have much more to say, we just have to wait and see what Ankama does in the next update. The beta should come out in the next few days, so stay tuned for more information, and I'll surely make a new video of the new Feca. Have a good day and see you guys later.